Additional to that, we're also going to need the vertical tail fin, which has part of the gearbox built into it, and also the other side of the tail gearbox, which is in this carbon part here. Okay, so here we have our first build step, and what we're going to do here is we're going to put the carbon fin here onto the gearbox like so, and then the smaller of the screws, the shorter ones here, they go in the back, and the longer screws here, they go in the front. And the idea, if you look at this, is that this is a split gearbox, so you can see the split there, and those longer pins are going to pinch that together to grip it onto the boom, whereas the shorter screws at the back just go into this metal block. Okay, so I'll go ahead and put that together. Now it's crucial at this stage that you don't tighten up these front bolts because we haven't inserted it onto the boom yet, so they just need to be lightly installed. But these rear ones, we can Loctite them. Okay, and there we have that particular build step completed. Note is that the flange of the bearing here is actually on the inside. So if you look at it, you can see that more of the bearing is actually towards the outside and the flange is on the inside here. Just make a note of that. Okay, so our next task is to fix this on the rear hole here using one of our standard small screws with Loctite. Okay, and there we go, that's installed, and if I just turn this over, you can see the other side of the gearbox there, and this is what we're going to be working on next, is this side here. Okay, so our next task is to insert the boom into our tail gearbox, and what you want to notice is that there is a hole in the boom here and there's also a cutout here, and these are designed to line up with this hole and this hole here. So basically the boom slides into the gearbox like so, and then you make sure that those holes, let's just pan out a little bit, go. We make sure that those holes line up, and then we're ready to do our next part of the installation. Basically this is a locator pin, and we're going to screw some screws through, and they're going to go through those two holes when we put the gearbox together, and that's why we need to make sure they're aligned. Okay, so our next job is to assemble our tail rotor bell crank, and for this we just need to put the bearings into the bell crank initially. So there are two of those bearings here, and in between them is this little gold washer. So basically you push one bearing in, turn it over, drop the washer in, and then push the other bearing in. Okay, and there we have that assembled, and you can see the bearing in there and the other bearing, and you can possibly just see the spacer washer in the middle there. It's just barely visible. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is to put the bolt through that and screw it into a bracket. Okay, so our next job is to screw the bell crank onto this bracket here. If you look at this bracket, if I just stand it up like that, basically we're going to screw this onto here, onto the back edge here. So if I just get something to point with. Okay, so we're going to be screwing onto this side here, and then this nut is going to go this side. So the bell crank is here with the bolt through it and the nut on this side. So I'll just install that and you can see what it looks like. Okay, so here's the bell crank which I've put this screw through now. We need to put Loctite on the little bit of thread that's poking out the end here. This piece here. And that screws into our bracket, and then we want to put Loctite on the end of the screw that then sticks out of the bracket to put the little nut on the end as well. So I'll bolt that on now and we can see what it looks like. Okay, so there we have our bell crank screwed onto the bracket. I'll just spin this around a little so you can see how it goes. And then this whole thing has to bolt onto our gearbox. So that's the next part. Okay, so here we have our gearbox, and then here we have the piece that we've literally just built, and this is going to bolt onto those center holes, which I'll try and show you this now. So that's going to go on the center holes. Try and orientate this a little bit towards the camera, so it's going to go on there like that. And then we bolt through, and we make sure that this is all aligned so that the holes in the boom are aligned with the holes here all the way through. And we put 2 small screws in there and Loctite them in place. Okay, and there we have it installed. Spin that around so you can just see. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is to work on the other side here. This is the point where we want to put some Loctite on these screws and tighten them up properly so that it grips nice and snugly onto the boom. Okay, so that's our boom now nicely secured, and I can't move it by twisting it or anything like that. So the next thing for us to do is to install these 2 plastic parts onto the boom. This one goes on first, and obviously we thread them on from this end, and then this one goes on second. So I'll put those on and show you how they go. Okay, so here we have our rear piece installed, and this is actually the horizontal fin holder. So you can see the rounded part is towards the bottom, and the flat part that our horizontal fin was screwed to is towards the top. And I've just pushed this down towards the tail gearbox to keep it out of the way. And then at the other end we've got what is effectively a servo holder. You can see how I've put that on. So the next thing for us to do is to pull the belt through the boom and install the boom into the back of the main frames that we built earlier. Okay, and this is what you should end up with. As you can see, my boom is actually poking right the way through and is coming out the other side. The tail rotor belt goes down through it, and then at the other end we have the belt coming out, and I've put already the necessary quarter twist in the belt for correct orientation of spinning the tail rotor. But we'll come on to that later. But for now, that's the belt installed, and we've now got to move on to building up the tail output shaft so that we can install the belt onto that tail output shaft and then build up the rest of the tail rotor. Okay, so here we have our tail output shaft, which has got 2 flats on it, as you can see here. Now our pulley, which is this one here, that actually goes on this end here. So as you can see, there are 2 flats. One is very near the end and one is indented a little way. So we're actually going to install this onto there like so. And then these 2 grub screws go into that pulley to secure it in place with some Loctite. Okay, so that's our pulley installed, and what I want to show you is that I've only tightened this up enough that it's located in the flat. So you can see that that's able to move up and down, but only within the bounds of the flat on the shaft. So the next thing we want to do is insert that into our gearbox and make the end here flush with the bearing, and then we can tighten up that set screw. Okay, so I've got my shaft inserted, and if you look here you can see that this end is completely flush, and I've then tightened up that grub screw there to hold that in place. Now we can put the grub screw in the other side and also Loctite and tighten that one up as well. But the main thing is to move this on the shaft with what little play you have got on that flat to get a nice flush shaft there. Okay, so there we have our tail shaft installed, and I've now moved it so the belt is actually around the pulley, although it's not tight at this point. Also, something I omitted to mention just now is that when you tighten up these grub screws, make sure you tighten the one that is against the rounded part of the shaft first before you tighten the one that is up against the flat. That just allows this pulley to seat properly on the tail shaft. If you tighten the flat one first, you don't get a nice seating of the pulley. Okay, with the tail shaft in place, you can then pull the boom out, so you can see my boom is no longer protruding here from the plastic casing. The belt is now tight and located around the pulley, and at the back here the belt is around the tail output shaft. So at this point we can now install the other side of the gearbox housing here to just hold the shaft in place. Okay, so here we have that other side, and again you can see that there is a flanged side to it, which is this side, and then a side which just has the bearing poking through it. This side that has the bearing poking through goes to the outside, and the flange of the bearing goes to the inside against the tail pulley. So I'll just put that on. Okay, so there you can see that's just been slid onto the shaft. If we take a top view, you can see the two pieces of the bearing poking towards the outside and the flange of the bearing towards the middle. And obviously that looks a bit skewed at the moment, and the reason for that is that we haven't actually put the screws in. The belt is pulling the tail shaft towards the boom slightly, so once we put the screws in and tighten that up, that kind of skew in the shaft there should disappear. Okay, and we secure that plate with 3 of our small 130-035 bolts, which you can see there. I'll do that and we can take a look at it. Okay, so there we have it installed. I'll just show you the... Yeah, you can see the bolts on it there. So at this point you also want to align your tail gearbox so that this vertical fin is dead vertical and that the tail output shaft is at 90 degrees to the frames. And at that point you can then do up these front 2 screws here with Loctite. Do those up tight, but don't do up these rear ones just yet. So just these front ones, and that should hold the boom in place whilst we complete the rest of the build. Okay, so next we're making up our tail pitch slider, and this is the slider ring, which needs to have 2 bearings installed into it, one from each side. Basically we need to put a bit of green thread lock around the outside of these bearings and then push them into place using a flat metal surface. They shouldn't be hammered in or anything like that, you just got to push fit them in and press them into place. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so there's the bearings installed, and once you've done that, and believe me, it's not easy to get these bearings in, they really need pushing in quite firmly, and in the end I ended up using a small hobby vise in order to get the pressure I needed to put these bearings in and seat them nicely. Once you've got that together, you can then slide this part through the 2 bearings, and then we're going to screw this piece onto the thread that's sticking out once this has been inserted through. Okay, and once all together it should look something like that. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is to install these little pieces here onto our pitch slider. Okay, so for this next piece we're going to install one of these here onto our pitch slider. Now what I want to show you is that there is a little kind of raised edge here, and then there's a flat edge to the pitch slider, and we're installing these onto that raised edge. And then when you look at these, there is a flanged bearing in either side, and basically you want the open-ended part of the bearing, so that part of the bearing there, to go up against that raised piece, so the flange of the bearing is facing outwards and has the screw head going through it like that. And then you should be able to see the open-ended bearing here, the other side. It's going to go like that, effectively, with the screw going through the middle, with some thread lock on it to hold it in place. Okay, and you should end up with something that looks very much like this. Everything moving nice and freely, smoothly. Okay, so we've come to the point now where we're going to put our blade grip bolts through the bearings that go into the blade grips themselves. And what I've noticed is that the screws that are labelled as hash 130040, I think it is. Just checking here. Yeah, 130040. There are actually two different types of them. There are these kind of button-headed ones, which I've got here, and then there are the ones that I used to install the tail fin onto the gearbox, and these have actually got a slightly bigger head on them. Now looking at this, I think that these screws are actually the ones that we should be using for the tail rotor, because these have got a bigger head on them and should take a bigger loading than these ones with the little button. Is I'm going to uninstall these screws from here, putting these button headed ones in here, and then take these kind of normal headed screws out and use them for the tail rotor. Okay, so there we have our screws installed, and as you can see, these are more like a kind of an M2 bolt than the button headed ones that I just swapped over into the vertical tail fin. So I think these are the ones that are meant to be used for the tail rotor. These should have a stronger head on them. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is install these into our hub. So this is our hub here, and we need to install these onto our hub. And we also have a bearing that needs to go between the hub and the screw. So I'll put that together and you can have a look. Okay, so we have to install our screw into our hub, and between the screw and the hub we have these spacers. They look like bearings, but they're actually a spacer with like a little hole in them, a little threaded hole in them, and we need to install those onto this brass piece here, and then this can be bolted into our hub. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to bolt this into our hub. Here we have our hub, but between this and the hub there is like a little spacer, which is this thing with a little hole in it, which goes onto that brass sleeve, and there is also another bearing which goes onto the hub. So that bearing, which I'm just trying to insert to the hub, let's just okay, so that bearing goes on there, and then this sleeve goes on there, and then that screws into there. with thread lock. So I'll do that for both sides and we can come back and have a look at it. Okay, and then we have our hub with bearing, spacer, bearing, and then the same the other side, bearing, spacer, bearing, and the bolts securely Loctited, ready for installation of the blade grips. We have those here. Here's our blade grips. And those basically align onto the bearings. They're going to be a very snug fit, so I'll do this off camera, but I'll put those onto the bearings and then I'll show you how you line those up to fit them. Okay, so here's the blade grips installed. Now on this particular blade grip here, I've actually put the securing bolts in that hold the blade grip in place. But basically those bolts go into that spacer that had threaded holes in either side. So on this blade grip here, I've lined it, before I pushed the blade grips on, I lined it up so that the holes would be in alignment with the hole in the blade grip, and then pushed it into place. And then you can screw the screws down into the spacer and that holds the blade grip on. And of course these are a counterweighted blade grip. That's what these bits sticking out are, to counterweight it to make it very easy for the tail servo to control the tail rotor. Okay, so I'll put the screws in the other side on this and then we can mount the tail rotor onto the tail shaft and put the tail blades on. Okay, so next job is the tail blades. Those are mounted with these single screws and just go into our completed tail rotor hub. Okay, and here we have the completed tail rotor. Take note that the control arm for the blade grip is the same side as the leading edge of the blade. Also, when you put these screws in, there's a non-threaded hole that the bolt head goes through, and then the other side is the threaded hole that the screw screws into. So just make sure you get those right. So the next thing for us to do is to put this and our completed tail pitch slider onto our tail output shaft and secure in place with these two screws and a grub screw to hold the hub onto the tail output shaft. Okay, and here we have the completed tail rotor. If I turn this upside down, you can see the ball is in the cup here. The little arms here have been screwed onto the blade grip with some Loctite. The tail rotor is orientated correctly in that the leading edge of the blade should be, of the bottom blade, should be facing towards the front of the machine, and it will rotate that way up towards the boom. And then the last thing to show you is the grub screw in the top there, which is holding the tail rotor onto the shaft. There's a flat spot on the shaft there, and that's Loctited and gripped onto that flat spot. And then the end of the shaft here is flush with the tail rotor hub. And it should all move absolutely freely, and you can see this is absolutely, no resistance to movement in it at all. It's absolutely free. That's how it should be. Okay, so that's the tail rotor complete.